Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. We all have a sin nature, and David was no different. As a man, he struggled with many of the same temptations that all men face. One in particular was his love for women. And in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, this monster within was going to raise its ugly head and do some serious damage to David's integrity and moral reputation. As revealed in chapter 10, David had developed a bad habit of delegating some of his responsibilities as commander-in-chief, and rather than leading his troops into battle, he was choosing to remain in Jerusalem. His decision to forego his God-given responsibilities as the leader of Israel's armies was going to set him up for a moral failure of epic proportions. And like any other sin, this one was going to have long-lasting and ultimately deadly consequences. David would learn the painful lesson that obeying your passions was never a good alternative to obeying God. There's a saying found in the book of Proverbs that reads, "Stolen bread tastes sweet, but it turns to gravel in the mouth." Proverbs 20, verse 17. This little proverb is very applicable to the story found in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. And what makes it even more interesting is that the book of Proverbs, in which it's found, was compiled by Solomon, the son born to David and Bathsheba. It's a simple proverb, but carries profound weight. What's forbidden often has a strong appeal to us, and when we get what we desire, it can provide a short-lived sense of gratification. But the proverb goes on to warn that the forbidden, once consumed, quickly loses its appeal and can have serious consequences. Stolen bread that turns to gravel in the mouth would not only leave a disappointingly bad taste in your mouth, but a face full of broken teeth as well. The story of David and Bathsheba is probably one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. How would you like it if one of the worst sins you have ever committed was chronicled in a book for everyone to read? One of the things about the Bible is its brutal honesty. It gives us the good, the bad, and the ugly regarding men. It doesn't attempt to paint a rosy picture about mankind, but goes out of its way to reveal the presence of sin in the lives of even the most faithful characters. All you have to do is look at the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Noah, Peter, and a host of other biblical characters to realize that sin is an ever-present problem, even for the most godly individuals. And David was no exception. As has been pointed out before, David had an inordinate love for the opposite sex. His attraction to women was his Achilles' heel, his weak spot. By this time in his life, he had already amassed for himself a collection of wives who had fathered him a number of children, and this had been in direct disobedience to the command of God. And it's interesting to note that David's growing collection of wives never seemed to scratch the itch he had. His lust was never satisfied. He never seemed to reach the point where enough was enough. He had more than enough wives to satisfy his sexual needs, yet there seemed to be in David a desire for the forbidden, an overwhelming drive for stolen bread. He wanted what he could not have. In the case of Bathsheba, David was in the wrong spot at the wrong time. The passage makes it painfully clear that it was spring, the time when kings go out to battle. 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. But David had chosen to remain in Jerusalem while his troops went off to war. He was the warrior king. It was his responsibility to lead his troops into battle. He was to be the protector of the kingdom. He had a God-appointed role to fulfill, but he had delegated it to Joab. And this was the first step in David feeding the monster within. David knew he had a problem. He was well aware of the lust that lurked within himself. And by staying home in Jerusalem, David set himself up for failure. He created the ideal opportunity in which to allow his lust to get the better of him. He was not doing what he was supposed to be doing. He was not where he was supposed to be. And Satan, the enemy, took advantage of the situation, knowing David's weakness and casting the perfect bait to lure David into sin. The Apostle James reminds us, "Remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, 'God is tempting me.' God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death." James 1, verses 13 through 15. Full fish don't usually take the bait. Well-fed fish are not as susceptible to the lure. And David's lust for women had yet to be satisfied because he had a heart problem. He had an insatiable desire for women, and no amount of wives was going to satisfy what was, in actuality, a spiritual problem. By staying in Jerusalem and refusing to go to war, David set himself up for failure. He found himself with idle time and an overactive libido. And it just so happened that, as he woke in the afternoon from a nap, he went onto the roof of his palace and spied a woman bathing. And his desires enticed him and drug him away. He saw, and he had to have. He lusted, and he had to satisfy that lust. Even though he was clearly told that Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah, who happened to be one of David's warriors. She was married, but that little fact carried no weight with David. David's lust led him to commit adultery, and before he could realize it, the sweetness of the stolen bread turned to gravel in his mouth. Eventually, Bathsheba broke the news to David that she was pregnant. The text had pointed out that Bathsheba, having just finished the cleansing for her menstrual cycle, as prescribed by law, was ready to conceive, and she did. This surprising bit of news threw David into overdrive. He immediately attempted to do damage control, trying to come up with a way to cover up his sin. He called Uriah home from the battlefront. David naturally assumed that Uriah would make a beeline to his home, have sexual relations with his wife, and the problem would be solved. But what David didn't take into account was Uriah's dedication to the king and allegiance to his fellow soldiers. He wasn't going to allow himself the pleasure of his wife's company while his brothers were still at war, so he slept with the servants of the king. And even when David got Uriah drunk, this faithful servant refused to go home. What a contrast we see between Uriah's behavior and that of David, the king. It's interesting to note that Uriah was a Hittite, a non-Jew, yet he proved to be more faithful than the man after God's own heart. His response to David's enticement to go home and be with his wife reveals a great deal about Uriah's integrity. The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing. 2 Samuel 11, verse 11. David's attempt at a cover-up was blowing up in his face. His little deception was falling apart right before his eyes, and David was growing desperate. He had committed adultery. Now he was attempting to cover it up. He was also trying to get another man to sin against his own conscience, all in an attempt to cover up his own sin. David had made the mistake of feeding the monster within, and now he was being devoured by it. His life was being consumed by his own sin nature. The Apostle Paul gives us a less than attractive list of the fruit that come as a result of giving our sin nature free rein in our lives. When you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear: sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21. It had all begun with David not being where he was supposed to be. Staying home in Jerusalem wasn't necessarily a sin, but it proved to be unwise. Had David gone off to war like he was supposed to do, he wouldn't have been on his rooftop that day. He wouldn't have seen Bathsheba bathing. He wouldn't have lusted. He wouldn't have committed adultery. And there would have been no sin to cover up. Take a look again at that passage in James. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. Do you see the pattern? Temptation, desires, enticement, sinful action, increased sin, death. The key to defeating the monster within us is to starve it. Paul reminds us, "So I say, let the Holy Spirit guide your lives. Then you won't be doing what your sinful nature craves." Galatians 5, verse 16. As long as David fed the monster within, he was going to find himself devoured from within. But if he had chosen to listen to the Spirit of God and do what God had called him to do, this whole affair could have been avoided.